socialization, and the life course. In this chapter, we will cover these three modules. We're going to talk about the role of socialization, the self, how the self develops, and the socialization throughout the life course. And then we're going to go through the agents, who the agents of socialization are. A look ahead. How does socialization help us behave properly? How much of our personality is shaped by culture versus by inborn traits or genetics? And in what ways does socialization aid in the transmission of culture? We just, spent the last chapter talking about culture and the importance of culture. This is the process in which that culture is transmitted through the socialization process, how we socialize people, individuals, and children. So in what ways does socialization continue through the life course? Sociologists love to track, we track things from birth all the way through old age. Who are the important agents of socialization during those various stages in our life? And how does socialization help shape our self-image, our development of ourself, our personalities, and things like that? So first, there is this debate, the nature versus nurture debate, and this is a debate over the importance of biological inheritance or genetics or innate properties, and the environmental factors in human development, these outside social forces. Most social scientists we've now moved towards this, beyond the debate, and towards this sort of idea that we know that there's sort of this combination of the two. So we need to acknowledge that heredity and environmental factors interact and influence the socialization process. So by definition, socialization is the lifelong process in which people learn appropriate attitudes, values, and behaviors. It starts in infancy and it continues throughout our life. We learn from those in our immediate circle, our family, our friends, our teachers, our coaches. And then we learn from those, even if people that we meet on the street, the people at the grocery store, people we see on TV, the internet, movies, magazines. Socialization helps us discover how to behave properly, as well as what we would expect from others. It provides for the transmission of our culture. It shapes the self-image that we have. Our socialization experiences help to shape our personalities, and personality is a person's typical pattern of their attitudes, their needs, their characteristics, and their behavior. Now, next thing we're going to talk about is when this socialization is lacking, when there is a lack of this social interaction. And it could have a really, really profound effect on our lives, more than just on our mental state. It can actually impact our physical well-being as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I have some case studies I want to kind of briefly talk about as well to enhance what we have here in your slide presentation. So in order to evaluate the impact of heredity and the environment, that nature and nurture factors on human development, is really helpful to examine what we call case studies, in cases where social interaction was absent. And so it's really an argument for why social interaction is so important in our lives. We encourage young people, from young children, to play and share and how to interact, and from a very young age. But this is true throughout our entire lives. And I think what we're going through during current times in 2020, these social distancing times, I think it's really many people are experiencing that lack of social interaction, how it can really impact the way you feel, the mood you're in, people feeling down, and it really can have a profound impact on our health as well. We can't go out to the gym and exercise and socialize with people at the gym, or doing everything in isolation is really has an effect on us. So first, this need for interaction is evident in the case studies of Isabel. Here we have, Isabel, and then Anna. Also, I want to talk a little bit about Anna, and then Jeannie. And I'm going to encourage and share in the module a link to the video, so you can watch the video about Jeannie, Jeannie Wiley. They call her Jeannie the Wild Child. So first of all, Anna was one of the earliest cases of child isolation. So I'm going to read you a little brief description of Anna. So Anna was one of the earliest cases of child isolation, and she was investigated by a sociologist. And Anna was born to an unmarried woman, a fact that enraged her mother's father. At first forbidden to bring the child into the house, Anna's mother attempted to place her in a children's home. When this proved too expensive, Anna was moved to a series of foster homes. And finally, at the age of 6 months, the child was returned to her mother. And because of the grandfather's hostility, Anna was confined to an attic room where she was given only the minimum of care. She was only fed enough milk to keep her alive and received almost no human contact. She was not spoken to, held, bathed, or loved. Anna finally was discovered by a social worker in 1938 at 6 years old. So keep in mind the dates. It's 1938 when these cases were discovered. And so back then, 1938, an unwed mother was considered to bring shame on the family, and so this grandfather, the father of Anna, was all he could think of is he needed to lock them away. And so very abusive, very dysfunctional in terms of the family structure. So Anna, she was discovered at the age of 6 years old, and she was a little more than a skeleton. She could not walk, talk, or feed herself. Her face was expressionless, and she showed no interest in other people. Over time, though, Anna made some progress. She learned, for instance, to walk, to feed herself, to brush her teeth, and to follow simple directions. It had a tragic ending, however. She died at the age of 10. And she had just begun to show some of the first signs of using language, but had only reached the ability of a toddler. So it had a profound, impact not only on her, cognitive ability, her mental capacity, her emotional state, but also physically. It physically damaged her. Isabel, which is mentioned here on your screen, lived in almost total seclusion in a dark room until she was the age of 6. Her maternal grandparents were ashamed of this birth. Again, this is the age. This is a time period, 1930s, when it brought shame on a lot of families. Unwed pregnancy, discovered when her mother escaped the house and took Isabel with her. She could not speak, and she could only use simple gestures. In fact, I'm going to read from my notes here. The story of Isabel, because it did have a somewhat happier ending than Anna's. She was, Isabel's mother was unmarried as well. She was found at about the same time. Isabel was found at about the same time as Anna. The child's grandfather kept her, and actually Isabel's mother was deaf. She could not hear and she could not speak. She was deaf mute, and but the grandfather confined both of them together. So Isabel had the advantage of having her mother with her. So although she was deprived of a normal cultural environment, Isabel did have this advantage of her mother's company. But because she and her mother communicated only through gestures, Isabel did not learn to speak. When she was found at the age of 6.5 years, she crawled around on her hands and knees, making grunting, animal-like sounds. She ate with her hands and behaved in many ways like a 6-month-old infant. Isabel was at first thought to be mentally disabled and mute as well. She could not speak, but after several months of intensive training, she did begin to speak. Eventually, she developed a considerable vocabulary, and after about 2 years of training, Isabel reached a level of social and mental development consistent with her age group. Kingsley Davis was the the sociologist who studied both Anna and Isabel. And he concluded that it was Isabel's constant contact with her mother that allowed her to overcome her deprivation. Next, we have Jeannie. Okay, so now before I discuss Jeannie's case in terms of isolation, I'm going to cover the additional arguments that support this idea of isolation and the impact on our development. So in addition to the studies, those case studies on Anna, Isabel, and even Jeannie, there have been studies that were done on children in Romanian and even Eastern European orphanages, the Ukraine and other places. These orphanages are where children were confined to their cribs and received very little adult contact. And there's very few adults to kind of take care of these children during the day. And while these children were adopted by families, this lack of social development became very, very evident when they were ultimately adopted out. And here, we have during the 1990s, public attention was drawn to these horrible conditions. In Romania, babies would lay in their cribs 18 to 20 hours a day. They didn't have, get out of their cribs. They were confined, to those areas. They just had their bottles to feed themselves. So there was very little interaction. So this type of care lasted until they were about 5 years old. So very poorly socialized. And so when, these families are adopting these children, they're coming to them with, needing services and needing help and support. So again, the lack of isolation is also, we can see if we look at the primate studies that Harry Harlow and his wife conducted in 1971. These are those cute little rhesus monkeys. So these studies also support the importance of socialization and in our development, our human development. Harry Harlow studied these monkeys, the rhesus monkeys, and showed that there was a damaging effect on the monkeys raised in isolation. They were very fearful. They were easily frightened, easily startled. And so they put these, in the cages, they put these artificial mothers. And one of the mothers was sort of all white chicken wire with a bottle for nourishment, for feeding. And then the other mother, if you could see in this picture, had a little bit more of a comforting face, and it's made with terry cloth. And so the monkeys would hang all day long on the terry cloth artificial mom. But when they needed that nourishment, they would reach over for just the feeding and then go back to the artificial mom with the terry cloth. That was much more comforting. They again raised in isolation, and the length of time also made a difference. The shorter period, then they can maybe be introduced, and it took some time to adjust to other monkeys. The longer they remained in isolation, so they might have done it for 3 months, 6 months, that could have profound effects. They were much more aggressive if the longer they were isolated. So they need this attachment, they need this interaction. And here we have an illustration of one of the early cases. This is a depiction based on a movie of the very first, was labeled The Wild Child of France. This young boy was found in total isolation. He must have been dumped off in the woods somewhere, but found nourishment somehow, maybe with a pack of wolves. And so, didn't learn how to speak, made grunting sounds, and was crawling around on his hands and feet. So this is just a depiction from the movie. Okay, so now I'd like to go back and go over the case of Jeannie Wiley. Jeannie was confined in isolation from the age of 20 months until she was found at age 13. No one had spoken to her. There was no TV or radio in the house. And despite efforts at socialization, she never achieved language ability. So, I'm going to go a little over some of the information I have in my notes about Jeannie. Again, it's critical to understand too that the age at which these young girls were found. Anna and Isabel were found at like 5 or 6 years old, but Jeannie wasn't found until she was 13. So she had suffered these consequences until she was a later age. And there are critical points in a person's language development that if they are, utilized, if she's not interacting, if she's not learning language, they may never develop. And that's sort of what happened to Jeannie. Jeannie was at an older age, and so your brain isn't stimulated, and so it would never go beyond what she had learned when she did finally find help. Sometimes, again, is it possible to reverse the effects of prolonged isolation, even with the help of specialists? This was true in the case of Jeannie, who was discovered in 1970 at 13 years of age. Jeannie had been confined to a small bedroom from the age of 20 months by her father, a man who hated children. Also, her parents were older. Her father was 57 when she was born, and he was 70 when she was found. And so there was another child living in the home, a brother. He wasn't treated like this. It was as if Jeannie, it was a very abusive family. They were living in isolation. Shrubs were growing up over the home. And they had a crisis that happened that set the father into this state. So the father kept Jeannie isolated and abused, hollered, yelled at the mother, his wife, if she did try to talk to her. So she spent her days tied to an infant's potty chair, and her nights wrapped in a sleeping bag, enclosed in a mesh-covered crib. Her world was almost totally silent, and she was beaten when she made noise. In fact, even if he did try to talk to her, he growled. Whenever Jeannie's father interacted with her, he acted like a wild dog, barking, growling, baring his teeth. So consequently, Jeannie never did learn to talk, and she was fearful. She would be growled at and barked at if she tried to talk. The room in which Jeannie spent all of her time was bare, except for the potty chair, the crib, 2 partially covered windows, a bare light bulb, and a closet. Sometimes 2 plastic raincoats hung outside the closet, and Jeannie was allowed to play with them. Her only other toys consisted of things such as empty spools of thread and an empty cottage cheese container. When Jeannie was found, she could not stand straight, and she had the social and psychological skills of a 1-year-old child. So even after 8 years of training, Jeannie had not progressed past the level of a 4-year-old child. She eventually was placed in an institution. She's actually still there to this day. This is a picture of her back in, I think, 1989. She is still alive. I believe her brother is as well. So if you watch the video, you'll hear what happened to her father. He had a tragic end to his life, and and even to the whole culmination of the story. So it is a very tragic story, but we would never take children and lock them in isolation and say, okay, let's do an experiment, have this group of children, locked in a room, see what happens, and compare them to the children who are left to live normal lives. It's unheard of to think of that. But this has happened, unfortunately, and the best we can do is learn from the impact that such horrible, neglectful situations, what they can do not only to the entire human being. So when Jeannie was, I believe she was a teenager at the time. This is an illustration that she drew, much like a young child at toddler age, maybe. My sons might have drew like this when they were children. And this is a picture of her, I think, and her therapist. Last bit of evidence to kind of drive this idea home, that it's really, we need to consider both biology and the environment. Because as sociologists, we kind of want to stress the importance of the environment, social interaction, societal factors. But we cannot discount biology and genetics. And in this case, we have the Minnesota twin study. And in the Minnesota twin study, the study has preliminary results that show that both genetic factors and socialization are influential in human development. Researchers are following pairs of identical twins that were raised apart. And one major finding is that twins had similar intelligence test scores when raised apart in roughly similar settings. So if the environment's the same, they found they had similar results. But if there were different scores when they were raised in very different social settings. So genetically they're the same, but the environment was different, supporting the impact, again, of socialization on development. Now, this is a longitudinal research study of over 9,800 individuals currently. Began in 1989 with 1,400 pairs of identical and same-sex fraternal twins. So, they look at this information. A lot of research has been conducted in using this data set. But it's been criticized. The validity of twin studies has been questioned because of this small sample size. Okay, so in this next module now, we're going to go over some theories, and we're going to talk about how the self develops over the life course. And again, as I mentioned, the life course is something that we study over time throughout a person's life, from birth all the way up through old age. And we study the socialization process during different phases in our life. We all have our own individual feelings, beliefs, and views. And the self is a distinct identity that sets each of us apart from each other. It is not static. It continues to develop and change. The interactionist perspective is useful here in our understanding of the development of the self, how the individual develops and modifies their self as a result of socialization. So our concept of ourself emerges as we interact with others. The personal qualities and impressions of how others perceive of ourself. So the first, we're going to cover different 4 sociological approaches to the self, and then we're also going to cover some psychological. First, we have Charles Horton Cooley's looking glass self. I mean, think of the looking glass. It's that mirror. It's that reflection of what we see when we look in the mirror. Alice in Wonderland's Through the Looking Glass, that's where the idea comes from. So according to Cooley, the self is a product of social interaction with others. That looking glass self, this view comes from how others perceive us. That image we give as of our reflection in a mirror. And there are 3 phases, and these are the 3 phases of developing our self-identity. We imagine how we present ourselves to others. So I'm going to use that funny example I've mentioned about wearing my wedding dress to class. The day I wore my wedding dress, I've got so many compliments. Everyone thought I looked really beautiful the day of my wedding. So I have this idea that I want to wear my wedding dress to class and see if anyone else likes it. Well, I imagine how I will present that to others. I think I look great in it. Then I have to stop and think, how will others evaluate me? In the moment, it's not appropriate to wear that wedding dress as a teacher in front of the classroom. It's not the right place. So I'm going to imagine a lot of people are going to laugh at me and make fun of me. Because first of all, it's not my wedding day anymore. And second of all, it's not Halloween. I wouldn't be dressed in a wedding dress if I were trying to dress up in a Halloween costume. So I imagine others will evaluate me as, maybe off my rocker. So then we develop this feeling about ourselves. I'd feel really, really funny and really embarrassed. So it stops me from doing that. Let me do another example. The morning when we're getting ready for our day, we might, brush our teeth, wash our face, check our hair out. So we imagine, okay, put this outfit on, this outfit looks okay, presentable. So we imagine how we're going to present ourselves. We imagine how others will evaluate us. I won't get laughed at. I won't get teased because I'm wearing a much more appropriate outfit. And it makes me really, really feel good about myself. So we develop a feeling about how, as a result, in that self-identity, we feel really good about ourselves. We have a positive impression, and it's going to carry on with us throughout the day. Now, if it rains on us and we have it messes up our hair, it might change throughout the day depending on different circumstances. But initially, that's how we develop this impression, how we want to give this impression throughout our day. And that's the looking glass self. Okay, another approach, the second approach, is George Herbert Mead, and George Herbert Mead's stages of the self. Now, there's dates here. I should have mentioned this earlier, but this 1863 to 1931, again, dates, you're not going to have to memorize them, but again, it's important to think about when he was presenting his theories. So George Herbert Mead said that there are 3 stages of the self. So this model defines the self as emerging in these 3 stages: the preparatory stage, the play stage, and the game stage. So first here we have the preparatory stage. And this is also known as the mimic stage. So if you've ever been around a baby and they kind of like, babies and children try to imitate the people around them. So sometimes they might repeat some of the phrases that you say. So you have to be careful sometimes what you say around children because they may repeat it. They start to understand the symbols that we use. We talked about in a chapter on culture. We start to learn symbols. So gradually children begin to understand the use of those symbols, language, for example, and they start to, as they grow older, they become more skilled at using those symbols. In the second stage, the play stage, this stage consists of children pretending to be other people, like as actors becoming a character. They take on a role. This is where you get a lot of children playing superhero and doctor and teacher and cops and robbers, those sorts of games that children sort of play. So they start to develop these skills in communicating with these symbols that they learn. They become more aware of the social relationships around them. They start to learn how to share, cooperate, and then they pretend to be other people, this role-taking. Now, role-taking is the process of mentally assuming the perspective of another and responding from that imagined viewpoint. So when you observe children observe their teachers or their coaches or their parents or even an older sibling. And so they might behave according to what they think that person's going to expect. So they may not, children want to do good things. They want to be praised by the people around them. So they behave properly in order to get that positive reinforcement. So through role taking, they learn to see the world from the perspective of other people. If I do this, will mom and dad be happy with me or will they be disappointed? And that sort of reinforces that sort of behavior. In the game stage, this is as children start to get a little older, they're around 8 or 9 years old. And so they're no longer just playing the role. During this stage, children grasp their own social position as well as everyone else's position around them. So they're considering several tasks, several relationships simultaneously. And through this process, children learn to assume their position, or we call it a status. So you assume that status relative to the position or statuses of others. So you hold a status and you play a role. Okay, you play a role in that status. So if you're, a son or a daughter, that's your status in relation to your parents, and you play a role. Your role is, to listen to your parents and obey them and, and follow their direction. Just as an example. Mead uses this term generalized other to refer to the attitudes, the viewpoints, and expectations of society as a whole that a child takes into account in his or her behavior. So, like in a game, you want to think about, that's why I have this chess game picture up here. We start to think about our role, our status, and our role within that status, and how if we move a certain place on this chessboard, what will you, before you make that move, you think about what everybody else is going to do. So you start to generalize about society. Well, my parents don't like it when I use bad language, but neither does the woman at the grocery store or the bank teller or my teachers. And so you generalize about how other people think about you as well. So children start to realize it's not just important to be polite because your parents want them to, tell them to be polite, but other people you encounter value politeness as well. And so it really influences a child's behavior. And here we have these different stages, the preparatory, the play, and the game stage. And we, ask the question, is the self present yet? No, it starts to develop. And then by the game stage, yes. And we have the definition and a couple of additional examples here. Here we have the third approach. Again, George Herbert Mead, but this is his theory of the self. And according to Mead's theory, the self begins as a privileged central position in a person's world. Children picture themselves as the focus of everything. Again, if you've been around children, children believe they're the center of the universe, and rightly so. So, they think about, the world's really revolving around them. I've seen this experience myself with my own sons when they were really young. Oftentimes they would come home with homework, and they just assumed that I knew what their homework was all about, as if I had this sort of telepathy with their teachers. But they think that everything revolves around them, and that everything adults should know what's going on in their lives. But that's where it starts, and then you start to realize and recognize that there is more to life than being the center of the universe. Children picture themselves as the focus of everything around them. As people mature, the self changes and it begins to consider the reactions of others. Now, Mead used this term, significant others, to refer to the individuals who are most important in the person's development. And the significant others are your child's parents, their friends, their teachers, their coaches, those in the immediate circle in their life. And then beyond that is the generalized others, as we just talked about. Here is the fourth sociological approach, and it's Irving Goffman's presentation of the self. According to Goffman, we learn early on how to give impressions of who we are. And this is known as impression management. We learn how to adjust the way we present ourselves to create distinctive appearances and satisfy a particular audience. And this we talked about earlier. It's also known as the dramaturgical approach, where people are viewed as actors or performers on a stage performing an action. So, for example, when you want to give a good impression, if you're trying to ask someone out on a date, you want to give a good impression. You want to put your best face forward when you do that. And so, or here's a better example, going on a job interview. You want to give a good impression especially if you want the job. So you want to, you put on your best clothes. That shows, you're polished and you want this particular job. You design your resume to show all of your skills. And so when you're talking to someone at your interview, you're really trying to give the best impression, put your best foot forward. As opposed to if it was just a conversation, a familiar conversation you're having with your friends. So you adjust these roles based on who you're talking to and who your audience is. See if you've ever heard of the impression saving face. This is where this idea of face work comes in. And it's sort of a need to maintain a proper image of self to continue an interaction. So, for example, Goffman's face work involves people trying to maintain that image or that face. We do face work in order to continue this social interaction. If you didn't do well on an exam, you might say, I didn't have time to study. That's why I didn't do well on the exam. Or I didn't get enough sleep last night. We try to maintain that sort of self-image. Or say you were trying to get someone's phone number and you're hanging out with your friends, you're like, I'm going to go get that person's phone number. You go over and they don't give it to you. So you go back to your friends and they say, hey, did you get her? And you might say, oh, no, I didn't, I really didn't like that person anyway. I didn't really like, we didn't hit it off. So you sort of save face. That's the idea. So we put on this, we try to maintain that self-image in order to maintain our social interactions. Next, we have our psychological approaches to the self. The previous ones are sociological. You see some overlap for this, especially if you've had a psychology course. There actually is a discipline, called social psychology, and so you'll see a lot of overlap if you ever take that course. So Sigmund Freud is a well-known psychologist who emphasized the role of the inborn drives. Yet, he did recognize the self as a social product. According to Freud, the self has components that work in opposition to each other. So he stressed the roles of those inborn drives. But part of us, he says, seeks limitless pleasure, while another part seeks rational behavior. So those natural impulsive instincts are in constant conflict with societal constraints. You have the id, the ego, and the superego, if you've ever heard of those concepts within Freud's theory. So he recognized that, okay, we've got this idea of limitless pleasure. So think about a kid in a candy store. They walk into a candy store and see all this candy and you want it all. Okay, you want every piece of candy. You want the Hershey bars, you want the Skittles, you want the gummy bears, you want the Hershey Kisses, you want everything. The lollipops, any kind of candy you can imagine. Well, there's a side to us that says you can't really eat all that candy. Number one, there's reasons why you don't have enough money to buy it all. If you do, it's going to make you sick. If you can get cavities, too much sugar, if you're diabetic. So there's a lot of reasons in society, like why your parents might not let you. So again, if you're that kid in the candy store, you want it all, but you can't have it all. So in the middle is sort of this compromise. So, well, have one Hershey Kiss, and that should maybe satisfy. So you kind of make that compromise in the middle. So this is, sort of Freud's idea. And it's those societal factors that sociologists would be most concerned with, and that's what Freud acknowledges does keep people in check. He also, again, believed our personalities to be influenced by others, especially our parents. Next, we have Swiss social psychologist Jean Piaget. And he emphasized stages that humans progress through as the self develops. He believed that children are gradually socialized into social relationships within a very self-centered world. Piaget is well known for his cognitive theory of development, which is made up of 4 stages, which we'll go over in a minute. So he found newborns to have no sense in the self of a looking glass image, quite self-centered. But as we mature, we become gradually socialized. He emphasized those stages and that social interaction was key to our development. So here's Piaget's cognitive theory of development. The first is the sensory motor stage, where young children use their senses to make discoveries. So think about the 5 senses. You have sight and smell, taste, touch, sound. So a child's using all of those senses to really explore their environment. Baby puts something in their mouth, they drop it to the floor, they're looking at things, and so if there were a deficit in any one of those senses, it would raise some alarm. And the next stage is the pre-operational stage. The child begins to use words and symbols, and so that's why it's important to always really talk, read to young children, even though they may not be talking yet, but hearing, though they learn to use those words and symbols. Concrete operational stages, the next stage, and this is where the child engages in more logical thinking. They start to make sense of those things, make sense of the symbols and the words that they've already have at their disposal. And the last stage is where we move into adolescence, and that the adolescence becomes capable of more sophisticated, abstract thought, logical thought with ideas and values. Moral development starts to become more apparent at this stage, and it becomes very, very linked to socialization. So again, Piaget believed social interaction was key to our development within these stages, in these stages of development. So here we have all of the approaches, the sociological, the psychological. And again, if you're doing 3x5 cards, this is a nice table to kind of get the information to put on those cards to help you with your studies. Okay, next we're going to talk about socialization throughout the life course. Socialization continues throughout our lives, through the entire life course. We go through various rites of passage that mark these changes in a person's status. Various cultures often have ceremonies or celebrations that mark these rites of passage. And rites of passage are rituals that mark a symbolic transition from one social position to another. So when you move from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, many religions actually incorporate various ceremonies, confirmations, bar and bat mitzvahs. So they often validate or dramatize a change in a person's status. And these are worldwide phenomenon. The life course approach to socialization looks at social factors that influence people throughout their lives. Those who take this approach examine major life events that indicate transitions from youth to adolescence to adulthood. The most difficult socialization challenges occur in our later years. We would think that it's in our younger years. The teen years are we think back on our teen years and they might have been the toughest. But it isn't until we become older and we transition from adulthood into our senior years that socialization becomes most challenging. Because there's often, the older we are, we face decline in our physical abilities. We have to face retirement, what we've done as a career maybe our entire lives, and then changes all of a sudden. So there's often a lot of negative stigma attached to, in some cultures, to the self-image of becoming older. But again, so other transitions, marriage and parenthood, they are not as important as they once were in that transition. We don't look at those as sort of markers to the transition to adulthood any longer. And more so, we think of, completing school or becoming financially stable or living on our own apart from our parents. They're much more important. Learning how to drive, we regain that independence. And then as we get older and we are no longer, physically able to drive, that becomes a very, challenge in giving up that independence. So we have additional terms of youthhood, emerging adulthood, and not quite adult. There's another term we use, adultolescence. We're extending the years in which we are not quite taking on adult responsibilities, but still maybe extending our years in school before we actually move out on our own and become financially independent. And I kept this slide in here from a previous edition of the text. It really shows what we consider to be the most important milestones in the transition to adulthood. It once was highly valued to consider marriage and parenthood as that, but the percent of people who think that is quite important has reduced, and much more so, being financially stable, completing our schooling have become more important. Just a couple more concepts I want to talk about before we go into our agents of socialization. We talk about anticipatory socialization, what that is, and resocialization. We'll define that. Anticipatory socialization, or actually these two terms, anticipatory socialization and resocialization, are two types of socialization that occur through our life course. Anticipatory refers to when a person rehearses for a role they will likely take on in the future. So it's that process in which we rehearse for a future position, an occupation, or even a social relationship. So many, expecting parents, they might take a baby course to kind of learn what to expect when they're expecting, once the baby's born, or a high school student who plans to attend college. You remember, the senior year, you were looking at different schools, visiting those schools, seeing if you could see yourself there, that sort of thing. So, and a college student who's embarking on a career, you might go on some interviews or, take on an internship to learn what it's like, do a student teaching of a course to see if you like to teach young children or you prefer to teach high school and older. So it's sort of an anticipatory process. Resocialization occurs when a person decides or discards a former sense of their self and behavior in order to take on a new self, a new life, a new role and responsibility. It typically involves considerable stress for the individual. Some resocialization is only minor. Say, for example, you change from one job to another. You already know what's expected for you in the job market. You have to be at your job at a certain time. You work for a certain number of hours. But say, for example, you work at Wawa and you make coffees at their coffee bar. And then all of a sudden you see a job at Starbucks and you want to apply there. Well, you know how to make coffee, but you may need to re-socialize into how to make Starbucks coffee and how to work with the people that are there, how to interact with those people as opposed to the people in your formal. That's a form of resocialization. Some of it, though, is much more dramatic, and we'll talk about that next. So Goffman suggests resocialization can really occur when we enter what he calls a total institution. So we really discard a formal part of our identity and take on a new part when we enter a total institution, where this institution regulates all aspects of a person's life. And this would happen if you, say, join the military or enter the priesthood or become a nun or even go to jail, prison, which would not be a consideration, but that's sort of when that happens. It's a total institution that takes over a person's life. And you'll see an example of that in the Stanford prison experiment. So a total institution will regulate every aspect of a person's life and often involves what is known as a degradation ceremony. So in Goffman's resocialization, when it comes to a total institution, any and all activities within that institution are conducted by the organization. You have to rise in the morning when they tell you to rise, wear a uniform. So in the military, everyone wears a similar uniform. They might have to have their hair shaved. Sometimes, they're called out by a specific command. A prisoner would be assigned a number. So all aspects of that person's life are in order to fulfill the purpose of that organization, the military, the priesthood. And so you discard every part of your self-identity that makes you unique because you're going to be like everybody else. So people often lose their individuality in these institutions. And the degradation ceremony is sort of that ritual where the person becomes secondary to the environment, to that social institution, to that overbearing social environment. You're assigned a number. You're called out by your number. You have to, show, high regard to the person, your commander, and so forth. So you become, the individual becomes secondary to the environment. And the degradation ceremony sort of strips you of your identity, takes your personal belongings away, and anything that kind of creates that unique individuality. Okay, now this last module, I'm going to go over the various agents of socialization. So agents of socialization, we interact with throughout the lifelong socialization process. And it involves many different social forces that influence our lives and alter our self-images as we go along the life course. The most important of these is the family. The family is the most important socializing agent, and it begins very soon after birth. Other agents include those on this list, and I'm going to go over each of these. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about the family. These all of these agents are cultural influences. If you look at them, school, your peer group, the media, mass media, technology, where you work. I already talked a little bit about that, but we're going to talk more on how your work influences you, how religion, and even the state. Race and gender also have an impact. A parent will guide their children into those gender role stereotypes. This is something I briefly was trying to illustrate with the content analysis in the Zoom meeting. We talked about how we buy children books, or children are exposed to these books in the libraries and in their preschools and in their elementary schools. Girls are typically socialized by their mothers and the female figures in their life. Fathers, in some boys are, again, socialized by fathers in society. We learn, children learn their masculine. What is masculine? What are the feminine roles? And what are those norms to follow? So gender roles we'll talk more about in a future chapter, but gender roles are those expectations regarding the proper behavior, attitudes, and activities of males and females. And so here we have those definitions where gender role is what parents typically are the ones that reinforce. Typically the traditional gender roles. We're seeing a movement away from being so strict about this, but in most societies, children are socialized by their mothers and boys being socialized by their fathers. And it's illustrated within the family, and then it becomes reinforced in future social institutions like the school and like religion. But family members, just to reinforce, are the most important part of the social environment. Whether a child comes into the family through birth, through adoption, all families engage in socialization. From the time we find out, now we have these gender reveals. In fact, my family's going to experience that over this next weekend. My nephew is expecting a baby, and they're having a gender reveal. So it's my first time ever. It's virtual, but it's the first time I'm ever going to experience this. And because they didn't have these back when I was starting my family. And so, but now we can, they have the technology to know the gender of a baby before it's even brought into the family. So families start to, decorate the nursery, and the socialization starts before birth. We, maybe you want to be gender neutral, so you take that extra effort to buy all neutral items for the child. Or you don't want to be so strict in, channeling the child into strictly gender, or maybe you do. So girls will get pink things, boys will get blue things, and so we start to see this process as family members become very excited before the baby joins the family or the child. So socialization is very much influenced by both race and gender. And again, we see through culture and through background experiences what the family values will often be brought into that socialization process. And then it becomes, really enforced through schools. So schools are mandated to socialize children into the norms and values of the culture. So what is, a norm and value here in the United States might be different if you say you're going to school in the UK or United Kingdom. So they have this mandate to socialize into the norms of our culture, which is very functionalist way of thinking. Schools teach the values and customs of the larger society. Traditionally, children are socialized into the conventional gender norms, so again, that's reinforcing those traditional gender stereotypes. Functionalists believe that schools fulfill the function by socializing children, while conflict theorists believe schools reinforce social class divisions that are present in society. So there's that, differences in social class, where schools are, what neighborhoods, more affluent neighborhoods might have more access to various resources. And so conflict theory can very much analyze this concept, this idea. And we'll talk more about that if we do have time to get to our chapter on education with conflict theorists Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. So schools, again, reinforce those social norms. Another agent of socialization is the peer group. Peer group is considered one of the significant others. And when we're, as we grow and as our, we start to develop, we start to really rely on our friendship networks, our peer groups. So as a child grows, our peer group, as children grow older, the family becomes somewhat less important as social development, while the peer group starts to increase in importance, especially as we get to our adolescent years. So as we grow older, as Mead suggests, that significant others, the peer group takes on a more impactful role. Gender differences are most noteworthy among adolescents, the influences that they make in our choices and so forth. Next, the mass media and technology. The mass media has become important in terms of an agent of socialization, the radio, probably more so movies, music, TV, the internet. Today, 95% of those aged 12 to 17 are on the internet. And so socialization increasingly occurs online. People have been socialized into relying on these new forms of communication and technology. I've become more so the more I have been teaching online, and so you kind of depend on a good Wi-Fi connection and internet, and being able to socialize in these times of social distancing. We are relying on this technology so that we can stay in contact and socialize with others and be able to communicate. Not all are widely available, and so in developing countries and even in areas within New Jersey and South Jersey, where some students are not being able to gain access to the internet, to technology, or a technology that works fast enough to run this different sorts of platforms. And so that becomes an issue, especially if we're delivering education in this platform. So we need to be able to make sure everyone can have access to the technology for information purposes, to get that information out as quickly as possible. So with the onset of this new technology and online monitoring, many parents become involved in how much they monitor their children's online activity. How much is too much? And do we need to institute parental controls? And I can tell you firsthand, this has really been a tough one for me. I didn't have this technology as I was growing up, so trying to monitor and seeing what's safe and what's not safe, trying to give my adults sons and their teenage sons their independence, while at the same time making sure they're safe online. Just this past week, my youngest son came to me being cyberbullied. He showed me an instance where a person wrote a comment to him on his YouTube channel that was really a form of cyberbullying. And it's sort of, you want to keep safe from those kinds of things when you're using the internet, especially as a parent. So if we have time, you want to try to think about these questions. How important is it for us to monitor our children's activity? This is just one of those culture lags where the technology is there, and so many parents have to really catch up to this technology. To what degree does it vary in terms of a person's level of education, their income, even their race? How many people really incorporate this as part of their family values. Do you want your children online? Do you want them watching this much television or having this much tech time? So really all plays a big part in how we would like to socialize our families and our children. So a couple last two agents of socialization are the workplace and religion and the state. So in the workplace, socialization occurs as we learn to behave appropriately within an occupation. So occupational socialization continues throughout a person's years in the labor market. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has found that from the ages of 18 to 42, the typical person has held 11 to 12 jobs. So that means we've changed jobs quite a bit. And so maybe, like, again, as I mentioned, a minor switch from one job to another where it's, a similar experience, but it's just a different way of doing things. Or it could be as drastic as, say, for me, I went from working in an ice cream parlor going through college to working at the Spectrum down at, where the sporting events are. So I had to learn a whole different way of doing things. I had to learn a switchboard and monitoring different events that took place in the Spectrum, sporting events, concert events. And it was a really exciting place to work. Totally different from being on South Street scooping ice cream. Equally fun, but different types of occupations. And so we learn to work with different people. And the more teenagers are working, the more times you're going to see these transitions. And now there are different types of jobs, technology-wise. One of my sons is now doing DoorDash, driving. So again, you have to be sure you know how to drive. You have to ensure you have a license. And so, gaining that experience is all involved in socialization. Not to mention it teaches you financial responsibility as well. Last two agents, religion and the state. State-run agencies have become increasingly influential in the life course. Child care centers, for example, have taken on family caregiving as more and more women are working. We need child care for our children. Government regulates things like the age at which we learn how to drive, the age at which we can work, without working papers, the age in which we can drink, the age at which we can get married without permission, our age to vote. So there's different things that regulate by the government when we can do certain things legally. So that's important. And then there are even religious rites of passage. In terms of religion having a high value in many people's lives. And so many religious organizations can stipulate certain traditional rites that bring people together in terms of community within the faith, even extending family within the different religions. So again, each has a way of socializing its community members. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge here. Unplugging. What happens? I've often given this challenge to my students and had them come back to class the next class period. Seeing if you can unplug for a day. Now, I would never suggest unplugging in terms of work and being connected to family. But even if you've tried this, tried to stay away from social media, getting together with a group of friends and saying, hey, let's try this. Can you really unplug? Do something else. For some students, they've come back and said, wow, it really opened my eyes to trying new things, doing something else that I wouldn't have done, maybe going for a jog or a walk. Now, it's really hard in this day and age of the pandemic to be able to do that. So I wouldn't challenge you under the circumstances at the moment. But it's something to think about, how, for many students have said, I can easily do this because I'm not hooked on social media and any of that. But I experienced just a couple weeks ago, we had a bad storm, and maybe you have too in the area. Storm came through, and the power went out. And so for 24 hours, we had no electricity. So it's something to think about, So maybe you want to give it a try, and if you do, send me your thoughts. And here in the actual study of this, these are the results in different countries where they actually had responses to a day without media. And it shows, you could see the color in the bar graph, how a person actually feels. For some people, they actually feel like this is an addiction. And for some, it was, they failed in doing it. Many people felt bored. They were confused, distressed, isolated, because if you're connecting through this medium, you can often feel isolated by doing so. And then there are many, in fact, in the United States, 23% saw the benefits of unplugging. So again, something to think about.